So I have this soft spot in my heart for Rube Goldberg machines. Does anybody remember Rube Goldberg machines? Okay, all right, lots of people here, okay. So these famous machines were named after a man who used to draw them in the cartoon section of the newspaper. And these machines would often follow a complex path of chain reaction where a shoe falling causes a line of dominoes to fall, and then the last domino hits a tiny catapult that tosses something into the air that then flips on a light switch. And at the end of all of this elaborate, complicated setup, something completely inane would happen, like a piece of toast would get made. The whimsical experiment has always struck me as wonderful, and I have fond memories of trying to create some of these when I was a kid. Does anybody remember the game Mousetrap? You know, that's kind of a Rube Goldberg machine. So I think about this kind of machine as a bit of a whimsical metaphor for our interconnectedness. How actions create chains of interwoven impacts. Now, the metaphor has its limits. Rube Goldberg machines need to be set up in a way where everything is planned, and I don't think that part applies very well to life. I don't think that there's a God who's set everything up in advance and kind of human beings are just sort of the dominoes that are falling. But I do think that there is nonetheless an interweaving, an interconnection to our interactions. Our impacts have deep effects, even if these are not planned in advance. We are more deeply tied to one another than we often realize. The poet Denis Levertov once wrote about this, and I'd like to offer her poem now. It is called The Thread. Something is very gently, invisibly, silently pulling at me, a thread or net of threads, finer than cobweb and as elastic. I haven't tried the strength of it. No barbed hook pierced and tore me. Was it not long ago that this thread began to draw me? Or was it way back? Was I born with this knot around my neck like a bridle? Not fear, but a stirring of wonder makes me catch my breath when I feel the tug of it and when I thought it had loosed itself and gone. I realize it is still there. I love the idea of this thread as it stands for our interconnection with one another. The same kind of interconnection that Mark Morrison Reed talks about in the passage that Carla read today, where he says that the central task of a religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. And another reading that I love from the back of our hymnal comes from Martin Luther King Jr., who put it this way: "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." These bonds, this garment, this thread, these are things that we can deny or fail to see. We can fail to see that our destiny is tied to that of others and act from a space of perceived isolation. Nonetheless, the thread persists. Today, we are blessing and thanking Anne for all of the work that she has done for us. And one of the things that I'm taking away from Anne is her favorite word. What is it, Anne? You don't know? You preach it every time you're up here. Okay. Covenant. It's covenant. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. But it is covenant. That's what I'm thinking. And covenant is an old word. It's an old word within Unitarian Universalism. It goes back to the founding of our religious tradition in the 1600s in New England. But what it essentially means is promise. It is about the promises that we make to one another. And we often talk about covenant and Unitarian Universalism as the promises that we make to one another in community, such as supporting one another with a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Today, we're going to be voting at our annual meeting, which is part of our promises to one another, attending to the health of the church through democratic participation and care. But covenant can also be much broader than the promises that we make to one another. We can imagine it extending not only to each other, but to all of creation. Indeed, we are born into this larger context. We are born into this network of threads. We are born into the human race, and we come into being as a part of the universe. The task of our religious community, then, is to show this interconnection and to remind each other of the promises that we must make in order to sustain it and respect it. That is our covenant to each other, and that is our covenant to life. Now, to talk about covenant is not only to notice the thread that binds all to all, but rather to nurture it and to care for it, to make sure that it is not cut. It is to feel and uphold the call, the tug of the thread, and to honor that interconnection. And often this means that we have to be the ones to do it, even when others are not doing it. We have to be the ones to stop the cycle of destruction that cuts the threads and dishonors life and other human beings. We have to be the ones to stop polluting the earth when others continue to do so. We have to be the ones to honor the thread, even when others seek to cut it. Now, I am thinking about that, especially given the news this week. I know I have strong feelings about the conviction of our former president. Part of me wanted to celebrate, I won't lie. But the other part of me wondered what good that will do. I've been trying to ask myself what good I am putting into the world, how my words and actions align with my sense of this connection, this covenant, this thread that I wish to uphold. And here is where we meet the rub. The habits of kindness or harshness that we cultivate transform the quality of the threads that connect us. It changes the web and it changes us. To try to ignore or cut the thread is dangerous. It harms everyone. Now, of course, we need to be critical and thoughtful and name harms that have been done. But we also need to choose how we do that and how to cultivate habits of kindness and love in our lives. So I'm going to end with a story. This comes from Scott Alexander, and I think it encapsulates this notion of this thread, this interconnection. And it offers a different vision for how we might choose to be with one another than our sort of perceived isolation. He writes this: I have a friend who traces her family roots back to the 17th century French Huguenots, a Protestant sect whose members, like those of many religious minorities at the time, were mercilessly persecuted by the established church. In this group, it was finally forced, those who had not already been killed were finally forced to flee France altogether. And the story about their escape, which has only been orally passed down from the friend's family through all the generations since, is that her ancestors were jammed into this tiny boat and forced to row across the choppy and treacherous channel to safety in England. Scott Alexander continues, as they began to row for their lives, it became painfully clear that there were just too many people in this small craft. Unless something was done, the boat would quickly swamp and all would perish beneath the cold waves. And so what did the group do? Did they draw lots and throw losers overboard? Did they set upon the defenseless, the sick, the elderly, and toss them into a watery grave? Did they decide that the least productive members of the community were the ones who needed to be sacrificed and then force them off the boat? The Huguenots could have chosen to view their lives in those terms. Scared, cold, desperate, they could have chosen which among them would die. They didn't do that. The Reverend Scott Alexander goes on to say this: I suppose they could have decided on any of these rational courses of action, but these beleaguered Huguenots did something else, something far nobler. Without any wailing or whining, the people in the boat decided that they would take turns, several at a time, swimming alongside the craft. And for many hours of this treacherous crossing, as these swimmers tired, others would quietly and willingly take their place in the numbing waters. And thus it was that that small boat and everyone who had sought refuge in it survived the treacherous crossing. So ends the story. There is this thread that very gently, invisibly tugs at us. It is finer and more elastic than cobweb, while at the same time it is insistent and it is real. It is a covenant of connection with all of humanity and all of life. We can ignore it, we can deny it, we can choose to push other people away and off of the boat, but we can never completely cut it. It is always there, offering the promise of a fuller, more creative, more compassionate way of being in community with other human beings and with all of creation. So may we, in this beloved community, find ways to honor and to uphold the preciousness of that. Because when the day is done, that's all that we have. That's all that we are. Nothing more and nothing less. Amen.